September 12th, 1814, brought golden afternoon light through the tall windows of Sinclair Hall, casting long shadows across the drawing-room where Eleanor sat with needle and thread, mending a tear in the ivory lace that would adorn her sister's wedding veil in precisely 3 days' time. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, though her heart performed a far less steady rhythm, each stitch a small surrender to a future she had long ago accepted would never belong to her. At 24 years of age, Eleanor Sinclair had perfected the art of invisibility, dressed as always in dove grey, her hair pinned simply, her presence so unremarkable that even now, as servants rushed past carrying armfuls of hothouse flowers, and her mother's voice rang sharp with instructions from the hallway, no one thought to include her in the excitement. Across the room, Lydia stood before the gilt mirror in vibrant blue silk, turning this way and that, her golden curls catching the autumn light as she practiced the precise angle of her smile. They shared the same face, Eleanor and Lydia, the same delicate features inherited from their mother, the same grey eyes and rosebud mouths, yet somehow society had declared one a diamond and the other merely paste. Eleanor knew the whispers well, had heard them rustling behind fans at every ball and assembly. Such a pity about the other one, they would say, so plain compared to her sister, no spark whatsoever, destined for spinsterhood surely. She had stopped flinching at such assessments years ago, had instead cultivated a quiet acceptance that served as armor against hope. The small birthmark behind her left ear, that tiny imperfection invisible to most, had become in her mind a symbol of all the ways she fell short of her sister's brilliant perfection. Lady Margaret Sinclair swept into the room without glancing at Eleanor, her entire attention fixed upon Lydia with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. "The Duke of Ravenscroft arrives within the hour," she announced, adjusting a curl at Lydia's temple with proprietary satisfaction. "You must be ready to greet him properly, my darling. This match will elevate our family beyond anything I dared dream." Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch at the mention of Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, the man who would claim her sister in 3 days' time. She had seen him only once, from a distance, at the assembly where the betrothal was first whispered as possibility, and something in his serious countenance, in the thoughtful way he had observed the room, rather than preening within it, had lodged itself beneath her ribs like a splinter she could not remove. He had met Lydia only 4 times since, each meeting brief and formal, a business arrangement dressed in the clothing of courtship. Eleanor understood that such was the way of their world, that marriages among their class were transactions of property and prestige, yet she could not silence the small voice within her that mourned what might have been had she been born the favoured daughter, had she possessed whatever mysterious quality made Lydia shine while she faded into wallpaper. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel reached her ears through the open window, and her heart seized with an emotion she refused to name, for the Duke of Ravenscroft had arrived. Eleanor fled the drawing-room before anyone could notice the flush that had risen to her cheeks, slipping through the servants' corridor and out into the garden where the late roses still clung to their fading blooms in defiance of the approaching autumn. She had taken her book of poetry with her, a slim volume of verse that served as both comfort and excuse for her perpetual solitude, and she settled onto the stone bench beneath the arbour, where the shadows grew long and the golden light softened into amber. Her heart had not yet steadied from that glimpse of the Duke's carriage, from the knowledge that he was even now in the house, speaking with her mother and father, perhaps already seeking out Lydia's company, and she pressed her palm flat against her chest as though she might physically still the treacherous organs racing. She had no right to feel anything at all regarding Frederick Ashworth, no claim upon his attention or his regard, and yet the splinter beneath her ribs twisted deeper with each passing moment. She was so lost in her own reproach that she did not hear the footsteps on the gravel path until a voice spoke from the gathering dusk, low and measured and closer than she had expected. "I had hoped to find a moment of quiet before the evening's festivities began," the voice said, and Eleanor startled so violently that her book tumbled from her lap, pages fluttering against the grass like wounded birds. She looked up into the face of Frederick Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, and found him studying her with an expression of weary surprise that shifted into something warmer as their eyes met. "Forgive me," he continued, bending to retrieve her fallen volume before she could move. "I did not mean to startle you, Miss Sinclair. I thought perhaps you were expecting me." The use of her surname without her given name told Eleanor everything, told her that he had mistaken her for Lydia in the failing light, and she knew she should correct him immediately, knew that propriety demanded she reveal the error, yet something held her tongue, some desperate hunger to know what it might feel like to be seen, even if only for a moment, even if only by mistake. "Your book," he said, offering it to her, and their fingers brushed as she accepted it, a touch so brief and yet so searing that she nearly gasped. "You read Wordsworth," he observed, and there was genuine interest in his tone, a curiosity that seemed at odds with his reputation for coldness. "I confess I am surprised. I had not thought." He paused, seeming to catch himself before completing the sentence. "Had not thought what?" "Your Grace," Eleanor heard herself ask, and her voice emerged steadier than she felt, touched with a hint of challenge she had not intended. "That I could read at all, or merely that I would choose verse over fashion plates?" The words escaped before wisdom could cage them, and she watched his eyes widen with something that looked remarkably like delight, before a laugh escaped him, low and surprised. "Neither," he admitted, "though now I find myself curious what other assumptions you might overturn." At that precise moment, Lydia's voice rang across the garden, calling for her betrothed with bright, possessive urgency. And Frederick turned toward the sound as Eleanor rose hastily from the bench, her cheeks burning with shame and something far more dangerous than shame. She brushed past him without another word, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender, and she did not see the way his brow furrowed as he watched her retreat, did not see him lift his fingers to his nose, as though trying to capture something he could not quite name, something different from the heavy floral perfume that engulfed him moments later when Lydia arrived in a rustle of blue silk and breathless apologies for keeping him waiting. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The morning of September 13th, 1814, found Eleanor hollow-eyed and weary, having spent the long hours of darkness staring at her ceiling while her mind replayed every moment of that garden encounter with merciless precision, the way Frederick's fingers had brushed hers when returning her book, the surprised delight in his eyes when she had challenged him, the way her heart had raced as though trying to escape the cage of her ribs and fly to him across the darkening garden. She had no right to such feelings, no claim upon the man who would marry her sister in 2 days' time, and yet guilt could not extinguish the ember that had taken root within her chest, burning low and steady and utterly forbidden. She dressed in her customary dove grey and descended to the breakfast room with the intention of eating quickly and retreating to some forgotten corner of the house where she might avoid both Frederick and the temptation he represented, but fate proved crueler than her plans. The family was already assembled when she entered, her mother presiding over the silver tea service with imperial satisfaction, her father hidden behind his newspaper, Lydia radiant in primrose yellow beside the empty chair that surely awaited the Duke, and Frederick himself standing by the window with a cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze turning toward the door at the precise moment Eleanor crossed the threshold. Their eyes met for one breathless instant before Eleanor forced herself to look away, moving toward the sideboard where she served herself toast and eggs while everyone else received their portions from attentive servants, a small humiliation so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She did notice, however, the way Lydia's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, the way her sister's bright smile seemed to flicker at the edges like a candle in an uncertain draught. And when Lydia shifted in her chair, Eleanor caught the glimpse of paper tucked into her sleeve, a letter hidden with careless desperation. Frederick took the seat beside Lydia, but his attention seemed oddly divided, his responses to her flirtatious remarks polite but distant, and more than once Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze upon her as she ate in silence at the far end of the table. Lady Margaret noticed too, her sharp eyes narrowing as they flickered between the Duke and her less favoured daughter. "Eleanor," she said with the particular tone she reserved for public correction, "must you slump so at table? You look positively defeated. Small wonder no gentleman has ever shown interest when you present yourself with all the appeal of a wilted cabbage." The words landed like stones in the quiet room, and Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks even as she straightened her spine with practiced composure. She did not see Frederick's jaw tighten, did not see the flash of something cold and angry in his eyes as he observed the casual cruelty with which Lady Margaret addressed her own daughter. But she felt the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, the tension that crackled like lightning before a storm. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the Sinclair Library, casting golden rectangles across the worn carpet and illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars in the still air, and it was here that Eleanor had retreated after the humiliation of breakfast, seeking solace among the leather-bound volumes that had been her only true companions for as long as she could remember. She had not expected anyone to follow her, had certainly not expected the door to open and admit Frederick Ashworth, who stood for a moment on the threshold, surveying the room with an expression of genuine appreciation, before his gaze found her seated in the window alcove, with her green leather journal open across her lap. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. "Your father mentioned you might show me the library. He claimed it houses a rather impressive collection of classical texts." Eleanor's heart stuttered in her chest, but she rose with what dignity she could muster, setting aside the journal in which she had been working on her translation of Sophocles. "I was not aware my father remembered I existed, let alone that I spend my time here," she said before she could stop herself, and colour flooded her cheeks at the bitter words. Frederick moved closer, his eyes dropping to the journal she had abandoned, and before she could snatch it away he had lifted it, scanning the neat lines of Greek text and the English translation she had written beneath. "You read Greek," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement filled with something that sounded remarkably like wonder. "I translate it," Eleanor corrected quietly. "For my own amusement, there is little else to occupy a spinster's hours." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch, his grey eyes searching her face as though seeking something he had lost and only just rediscovered. "And is that what you believe yourself to be, Miss Eleanor, a spinster with nothing but dusty books to fill her days?" The use of her Christian name, the acknowledgement that he knew precisely which twin she was, sent a tremor through her entire body. "It is what I am." "Your Grace," she answered, "what I have always been meant to be, the shadow to my sister's light, the footnote to her story." Frederick set down the journal and stepped closer still. Close enough that she could see the flecks of blue within the grey of his eyes, close enough that when he reached past her for a volume on the shelf behind her, his arm nearly brushed her shoulder. "And what would you want?" he asked softly. "If wanting were permitted? If your fate were your own to write?" The question struck her silent, for no one had ever asked what she wanted, no one had ever suggested her desires might matter at all. She opened her mouth to answer, but found no words, found only the treacherous sting of tears she refused to shed, and in that moment Frederick's hand covered hers where it rested on the bookshelf, warm and solid and real. From the doorway, unseen by either of them, Lydia Sinclair watched the scene unfold with calculating eyes, and a plan began to take shape in her desperate mind. The morning of September 14th, 1814, dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain, and Eleanor woke from fitful dreams with the certain knowledge that she must protect what remained of her heart by avoiding Frederick Ashworth entirely for the final day before he married her sister and disappeared from her life forever, taking with him the brief, impossible hope that had flickered to life in the library when his hand had covered hers and his eyes had asked questions she dared not answer. She dressed in her dove grey once more, armour against feeling, and slipped from the house before breakfast could force another torturous proximity, walking the familiar paths of the estate, with her shawl pulled tight against the autumn chill, while somewhere in the village a different drama unfolded in the cramped rooms above the apothecary shop, where Samuel Crawford kept his artist studio. Lydia had risen even earlier, stealing away in the pre-dawn darkness with her hood drawn low, and now she stood before the man she truly loved, with desperation written across her beautiful features as she laid out her plan in urgent whispers. "We are identical," she told Samuel, her hands gripping his paint-stained fingers. "If Eleanor wears the veil, no one will know until it is too late. She will be a duchess, and I will be free to marry you. Everyone gets what they want." Samuel's objections died on his lips as Lydia pressed closer, as she painted pictures of the life they could have together once she was released from the gilded cage her mother had built around her. And in his small studio, surrounded by half-finished canvases, he found himself nodding agreement to a scheme that would alter 4 lives irrevocably. Back at the Sinclair estate, Frederick prowled the halls like a caged creature, seeking Eleanor in the library where she was not, in the garden where only her absence lingered like the ghost of lavender, in every corner of the house where she had somehow anticipated his searching and vanished before he could arrive. His frustration mounted with each empty room, each servant who could not say where Miss Eleanor had gone, and he found himself standing at last outside the sewing room where the final fitting of the wedding gown was taking place, drawn by voices he could not quite hear through the heavy oak door. Inside that room, Eleanor had been summoned against her will to assist with last adjustments to Lydia's dress, and she stood now in numb silence as her mother directed the seamstress, while Lydia preened before the mirror in ivory silk with pearl buttons that caught the grey light from the windows, a veil of layered tulle so heavy and elaborate it obscured the wearer's features almost entirely. "Try it on her," Lady Margaret commanded suddenly, gesturing toward Eleanor with careless authority. "I want to see how the silhouette looks from across the room. Stand there, Eleanor, and stop slouching for once in your miserable life." Eleanor obeyed as she always obeyed, stepping into the cloud of silk and tulle, and when she turned to face the mirror, she saw not herself, but a bride, identical to her sister in every way that mattered to watching eyes, and the sight broke something inside her chest that she had not known could still be broken, sending her fleeing to her room as soon as she was released, to cry alone, while the wedding preparations continued without her, without needing her, without noticing she had gone at all. The clock in the hallway had just finished striking midnight when Eleanor heard the soft scratch at her chamber door, a sound so tentative she might have imagined it were it not followed by the whispered plea of her name in a voice she knew as well as her own. And when she rose from her sleepless bed to unlatch the door, she found Lydia standing in the corridor with a single candle guttering in her trembling hand, her beautiful face ravaged by tears that had left silver tracks down her cheeks, and her golden hair unbound and tangled as though she had been tearing at it in her distress. "Eleanor," Lydia breathed, pushing past her into the room and closing the door with desperate urgency. "You must help me. You are the only one who can save me from ruin, from a life of misery, from a fate I cannot bear to contemplate." Eleanor watched her sister pace before the cold fireplace, watched the candlelight cast dancing shadows across the walls, and felt a terrible certainty settle into her bones about what Lydia had come to ask, even before the words spilled forth in a torrent of confession and supplication. "I love him," Lydia whispered fiercely, turning to grip Eleanor's hands with fingers that burned like brands. "I love Samuel Crawford with every fibre of my being, and I cannot marry the Duke tomorrow. I cannot spend my life shackled to a man I do not love, no matter how wealthy or handsome or titled he may be. I will wither and die in that gilded cage, Eleanor. I will become a ghost of myself, and you know it to be true." Eleanor pulled her hands free and stepped back, her heart pounding with a mixture of horror and something far more dangerous that she refused to name. "What you are asking is impossible," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to rattle the windows. "It is fraud. It is deception of the worst kind. It would ruin us both if discovered." But it will not be discovered, Lydia insisted, moving closer with the relentless determination that had always bent the world to her will. We are identical beneath that veil. No one looks at you closely enough to notice, and once the vows are spoken, it will be done. It cannot be undone. You will be a duchess, Eleanor. You will have everything you ever dreamed of. Do not pretend you do not want him. I saw you in the library. I saw the way you looked at each other. The accusation struck Eleanor like a physical blow, and she turned away to hide the truth that must surely be written across her face, the shameful, hopeless love she had harbored for 3 impossible days. You would be saving me, Lydia continued softly, coming to stand behind her sister and resting her chin on Eleanor's shoulder, as she had done when they were children, sharing secrets in this very room. And perhaps you would also be saving yourself from the grey half-life Mother has condemned you to. Would that be so very wrong, to reach for happiness when it is offered, to take what fate has placed before you? Eleanor closed her eyes as the clock began to chime the 1/4 hour, as her sister's perfume enveloped her, as her own treacherous heart whispered yes, even while her conscience screamed its protest into the uncaring darkness of the night. The morning of September 15th, 1814, arrived wrapped in pewter clouds and the soft percussion of rain against window panes, and Eleanor rose from the bed where she had not slept to find that Lydia had already gone, vanished into the grey dawn with nothing left behind but a letter pressed into Eleanor's trembling hand by a maid who seemed not to notice or care that she was delivering it to the wrong sister. And when Eleanor unfolded the paper, she found words that blurred before her eyes as tears she could not stop streamed down her cheeks, words of gratitude and farewell and promises that this was the right choice for everyone, words that did nothing to quiet the thundering of Eleanor's heart as she realized that the moment of retreat had passed, and she was now committed to a deception that would either give her everything she had ever secretly wanted or destroy her utterly. The next hours passed in a strange, dreamlike haze as servants bustled around her with the efficiency of those who had been preparing for this day for months, and Eleanor stood motionless while they laced her into the ivory silk gown with its dozens of pearl buttons, while they arranged her hair in elaborate curls that Lydia had chosen weeks ago, while they dabbed Lydia's heavy floral perfume at her throat and wrists, even though the scent made her stomach turn with its wrongness against her skin. Lady Margaret swept into the room precisely once, casting a critical eye over the bride without ever truly seeing her, pronouncing the vision acceptable before departing to oversee the placement of flowers in the church, and Eleanor felt a hollow laugh building in her chest at the realization that her own mother could not distinguish between her daughters even on this most momentous of days. She tucked Lydia's letter into her glove, pressed against her palm like a talisman, or perhaps a confession waiting to be discovered, and when the heavy, layered veil was lowered over her face, she felt both imprisoned and protected by its concealing weight, hidden from the world that had never bothered to look at her closely enough to see her true self anyway. The carriage ride to St. Michael's Chapel seemed to last both an eternity and mere seconds, raindrops tracing silver paths down the windows like the tears Eleanor refused to shed, and her father sat across from her in uncomfortable silence, occasionally clearing his throat, as though he wished to speak, but could find no words adequate to the occasion. When the carriage stopped and the door opened to reveal the ancient stone church where Sinclairs had married for 6 generations, Eleanor felt her legs threaten to give way beneath her, felt the weight of her deception pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, and yet beneath the terror and the guilt there burned something else entirely, a flame of desperate hope that whispered, perhaps this stolen chance might somehow become something real, something true, something that belonged to her alone, in a life where nothing else ever had. The interior of St. Michael's Chapel swam before Eleanor's eyes as she walked the ancient stone aisle on her father's arm, the faces of the assembled guests blurring into a sea of silk and judgment through the heavy layers of her veil, and she could hear the whispers rising like incense around her, could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her chest until she feared her heart might simply stop from the pressure of maintaining this impossible masquerade. Frederick stood at the chateau, altar with his back straight and his face composed into that mask of aristocratic reserve she had observed over these past 3 days. But as she drew closer, she saw something flicker in his dark eyes, something questioning and alert that made her stumble slightly on the worn stones beneath her ivory slippers, and her father's hand tightened on her arm in warning as the assembled congregation held its collective breath. The vicar began to speak the ancient words that would bind them together until death, and Eleanor found that she could barely hear him over the rushing of blood in her ears, could barely form the responses that emerged from her lips in a voice she did not recognize as her own, a voice pitched slightly higher than natural in her desperate attempt to sound like Lydia, to become Lydia for these few crucial moments that would determine the entire course of her existence. When the vicar asked if any present knew of any impediment to this union, Eleanor felt certain that the thundering of her guilty heart must be audible to everyone in the chapel, that someone would surely rise and point an accusing finger and denounce her for the fraud she was perpetrating before God and man, but the silence stretched and held and broke only when the ceremony continued inexorably forward toward its conclusion. Frederick took her hand to place the ring upon her finger, and she felt him pause, felt his thumb brush across her trembling fingers in a gesture that seemed almost questioning, and when she dared to lift her veiled gaze to his face, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. His brow furrowed slightly, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not quite fit together as he had expected. The sapphire ring surrounded by diamonds slid onto her finger like a shackle, or perhaps a promise. Cold metal warming slowly against her skin as the vicar pronounced them man and wife. And when Frederick lifted her veil just enough to press a brief kiss against her lips, through the remaining layers of gossamer fabric she felt electricity arc between them, felt something shift and settle and change irrevocably in the space of that single heartbeat. Rain continued to paint silver patterns on the stained glass windows as they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, and Eleanor caught the sharp, knowing gaze of Lady Harriet Pembroke, fixed upon her with an expression that suggested Frederick's aunt saw far more than anyone else in that ancient chapel, saw perhaps the truth that hid behind the borrowed dress and the wrong perfume, and the desperate hope of a woman who had just bound herself forever to a man under the name of another. The carriage that bore them from St. Michael's Chapel to Ravenscroft Estate seemed to traverse not merely miles of rain-soaked countryside, but entire lifetimes of silence, and Eleanor sat rigid against the velvet cushions with her gloved hands folded in her lap, and her heart beating so violently she was certain Frederick must be able to hear it, even over the relentless drumming of rain upon the carriage roof, and she dared not look at him, dared not move, dared scarcely to breathe as the wheels carried her inexorably toward the moment of her unmasking and destruction. Frederick sat across from her rather than beside her, a choice that seemed somehow significant, his long legs taking up the space between them as he watched her with those dark, perceptive eyes that she could feel upon her even through the heavy layers of her veil. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured in a way that made her skin prickle with awareness. "You are very quiet," he observed, and Eleanor felt her throat constrict around the words she could not speak, the confession that pressed against her lips like a living thing desperate to escape, and she managed only a small murmur about the exhaustion of the day that sounded false even to her own ears. The gates of Ravenscroft appeared through the rain like a vision from some fever dream, wrought iron twisted into elaborate patterns that seemed to welcome and warn in equal measure, and as the carriage rolled up the long drive, Eleanor caught glimpses of the great house rising before them, its stone facade lit by dozens of windows that glowed amber against the storm-darkened sky, and she thought that she had never seen anything so beautiful or so terrifying as this place that was now supposedly her home. The servants lined the entrance hall in precise formation to greet their new duchess, and Eleanor moved through their curtsies and bows in a daze of unreality. following the housekeeper up the grand staircase with Frederick's steady presence behind her like a shadow she could not escape. The master chamber had been prepared with meticulous care, burgundy and gold fabrics draped across every surface, candles lit on every available space until the room glowed with warm, flickering light that should have been romantic, but instead felt to Eleanor like the illumination of an interrogation, and she dismissed the maid who came to help her undress with a voice that trembled only slightly, claiming she wished for privacy to compose herself after the long day. Alone at last, she moved to the window and stood staring out at the storm that continued to rage across the parkland, her reflection in the dark glass showing her a veiled figure who looked nothing like herself and everything like the ghost she had become. And when she heard the door open behind her and Frederick's measured footsteps cross the thick carpet, she did not turn, could not turn, could only stand frozen in place as he approached her slowly, deliberately, until she could feel the warmth of him at her back and hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Lydia," he said, and the name that was not hers fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor felt rather than heard him move closer, felt the warmth of his presence at her back shift as he reached up with deliberate slowness and began to lift the veil from her face, his fingers gentle but inexorable as they pushed aside layer after layer of gossamer fabric until the cool air of the chamber touched her flushed cheeks and there was nothing left between her face and his searching gaze, and she stood frozen in place with her eyes squeezed shut, like a child who believes that if she cannot see the monster, then perhaps the monster cannot see her. But she was no child, and he was no monster, and the silence that stretched between them felt like the held breath before an execution. "Open your eyes," he said, and his voice was not angry, was not cold, was something she could not identify, and when she forced her lashes to lift and met his dark gaze, she saw him studying her face with an expression of profound and terrible knowing. And she waited for the explosion of fury, waited for the denouncement, waited for her world to shatter into 1,000 irreparable pieces around her feet. "I know," he said simply, and the words made no sense to her, could not penetrate the wall of terror that surrounded her mind, and she heard herself stammering something about being sorry, about Lydia, about never meaning for any of this to happen, but he lifted one hand and pressed a single finger gently against her lips to silence her, and then that same hand moved with devastating precision to trace around the curve of her ear to find the small birthmark that had always marked her as the lesser twin, the plain one, the one who would never be chosen. "You are Eleanor," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a revelation, like a prayer, like something precious rather than something shameful, and she felt tears begin to slide down her cheeks as she nodded in mute confession, unable to speak past the grief and fear that clogged her throat. "I knew before the ceremony ended," he continued, and his thumb brushed away her tears with a tenderness that broke something open inside her chest. "I knew by the way your hand trembled in mine, by the way you smelled of lavender instead of roses, by the way your voice caught on the vows as though each word cost you something precious. And still I spoke my own vows, still I placed my ring upon your finger, still I kissed you through that ridiculous veil." "But why?" she whispered, and the question contained every fear she had ever harbored, every certainty that she was not enough, every resignation to a life of invisibility and insignificance. "Because I did not care," he said, and his voice was rough with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize. "Because the woman I met in the garden 3 days ago, the woman who laughed at my poor attempt at poetry and spoke of Greek translations with such passion that her whole face transformed, the woman who looked at me as though she saw something beyond my title and my fortune, that woman was never Lydia, and I found myself desperately hoping that somehow it would be her, standing across from me at that altar, and when I realized that my impossible hope had somehow become truth, I was not angry, Eleanor. I was relieved. Eleanor could not comprehend what she was hearing, could not reconcile the words falling from Frederick's lips with the lifetime of certainty she had carried that she was the lesser twin, the shadow, the one who would never be chosen. And she found herself shaking her head even as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper when she asked him how this could possibly be true, how he could have known and still spoken those sacred vows, how he could stand before her now without fury or betrayal darkening his handsome features. He guided her gently toward the settee that sat before the dying fire, his hands warm and steady around her trembling fingers as he drew her down beside him. And outside, the storm that had raged throughout their wedding day was beginning to calm, the thunder growing distant and the rain softening to a gentle patter against the window panes, as though even the heavens recognized that the tempest between them had passed. "I came to this marriage expecting nothing more than an advantageous arrangement," he began, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles as he spoke. "I had met your sister 4 times and found her pleasant enough, if somewhat exhausting in her constant performance of vivacity, and I resigned myself to a lifetime of polite coexistence with a woman I neither loved nor particularly understood, because that is what dukes do, Eleanor. We marry for advantage and hope that affection might develop in time. But then I arrived 3 days ago and wandered into a garden at twilight and found a woman sitting among the roses with a book of poetry in her lap and starlight beginning to emerge above her head. And she laughed at my clumsy attempt to identify the verse she was reading and challenged my interpretation with such brilliant wit that I found myself forgetting entirely that I was supposed to be searching for my betrothed. I thought I had made a mistake," he continued, his voice roughening with emotion as the candles burned lower around them and the shadows grew softer. "I thought I had somehow confused one twin for another, and when Lydia appeared, and I realized the woman who had captivated me so completely was not my intended bride, but her overlooked sister, I felt something very close to despair, because I had finally found someone who made me feel truly seen, and she was the one woman in the world I could not honorably pursue." He lifted her hand then, and pressed his lips to her palm in a gesture so tender that Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she had built over 24 years of being second best finally crumbling to dust. "I love you," she breathed, the confession escaping before she could contain it. "I have loved you since the garden, since you looked at me as though I mattered, since you asked about my translations as though my thoughts had value. And I know I should not have done this terrible thing, but I could not bear to watch you marry her when every part of me was screaming that we belonged together." "Then we are well matched in our sins," he murmured, and when he leaned forward to capture her lips with his own, the kiss was nothing like the brief, formal touch they had shared through her veil at the altar, but something deep and true and full of promise. And Eleanor kissed him back with all the hope she had suppressed for so long. The first pale light of dawn crept through the tall windows of the master chamber at Ravenscroft, replacing the storm-darkened shadows with soft golden warmth, and Eleanor woke slowly to the unfamiliar sensation of strong arms wrapped around her waist and steady breath warming the back of her neck, and for one disorienting moment she could not remember where she was or how she had come to be held so tenderly by another person. But then the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she felt her heart clench with a mixture of wonder and lingering fear that perhaps she had dreamed the entire impossible conversation, that perhaps Frederick would wake and realize he had made a terrible mistake in accepting her deception so readily. She lay perfectly still, afraid to move and shatter whatever spell had been cast over them in the candlelit hours before dawn. But then she felt him stir behind her, and his arms tightened briefly around her middle, and his lips brushed against the birthmark behind her ear with deliberate intention, and he murmured, "Good morning, Eleanor," in a voice rough with sleep, but warm with unmistakable affection. And the sound of her true name on his lips sent a wave of emotion through her so powerful that she felt tears prick at her eyes once more. They rose eventually, and breakfast was brought to their chambers by servants who betrayed no curiosity about the new duchess, though Eleanor was certain the household must be buzzing with speculation, and she sat across from Frederick at the small table by the window, wearing a borrowed dressing gown of deep blue silk that he had retrieved from his own wardrobe, and she thought how strange it was to be dressed in his clothing and sharing his private space when 2 days ago she had been certain she would spend her life as an invisible spinster in her mother's house. "We must discuss what we will tell society," Frederick said as he poured her tea with the same careful attention he might give to a diplomatic negotiation, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with renewed anxiety because she had been so overwhelmed by his acceptance that she had not yet considered the practical consequences of what they had done, the scandal that would surely erupt when the truth emerged about the switched twins. She withdrew Lydia's letter from where she had tucked it into the sleeve of the dressing gown and handed it to him with trembling fingers, watching his face as he read. Her sister's words explaining that she had fled to Scotland with Samuel Crawford and begging Eleanor's forgiveness for placing her in such an impossible position. And when he finished reading, he set the letter aside with an expression that might have been anger or might have been something closer to grim amusement. "Your sister has made her choice, and we have made ours," he said firmly, "and when the inevitable questions come, we will face them together as husband and wife, and I will allow no one to suggest that my marriage is anything other than exactly what I intended. Because from this moment forward, Eleanor, you are the Duchess of Ravenscroft in truth and in law, and anyone who dares to treat you otherwise will answer to me." The news spread through society like wildfire consuming dry autumn leaves, and by September 20th, 1814, just 5 days after the wedding that had united the Duke of Ravenscroft with what everyone believed to be the beautiful Lydia Sinclair, whispers had transformed into outright speculation, and the drawing rooms of London buzzed with delicious scandal about the switched twins and the Duke who had married the wrong sister, and Eleanor felt the weight of every curious glance and malicious murmur even within the protective walls of Ravenscroft itself, though Frederick had done everything in his power to shield her from the worst of the gossip that swirled beyond their gates. She was standing in the grand drawing-room, wearing a gown of deep sapphire blue that Frederick had commissioned for her the very morning after their wedding night, the first time in her 24 years that she had worn any colour other than the muted dove greys and browns her mother had deemed appropriate for the lesser twin, and the silk whispered against her skin like a promise of the new life she was only beginning to believe might truly be hers. Lady Harriet Pembroke sat nearby with her embroidery, Frederick's aunt having arrived 2 days prior to offer her support and her considerable social influence to the newly married couple, and her presence had been a balm to Eleanor's frayed nerves because the older woman had taken one look at her nephew's bride and declared with unmistakable warmth that she could see exactly why Frederick had chosen as he did. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel made Eleanor's heart stutter in her chest, and she knew before the butler announced the visitor that her mother had finally come to unleash the fury that had been building since Lady Margaret Sinclair discovered her carefully orchestrated plans for social advancement had been upended by her own overlooked daughter. Lady Margaret swept into the drawing-room like a winter storm, her face rigid with barely contained rage, and she did not wait for pleasantries before launching into a tirade that stripped away any pretense of maternal affection, calling Eleanor a scheming, ungrateful wretch who had stolen her sister's rightful place and brought shame upon the family name with her. Desperate, pathetic grab for a position she had never deserved and could never hope to maintain with any dignity. Eleanor felt herself shrinking under the assault. 24 years of conditioning urging her to bow her head and accept the criticism as her due. But then Frederick stepped through the doorway where he had been listening unseen, and his voice cut through Lady Margaret's venom like a blade through silk, cold and precise and utterly final, as he informed his mother-in-law that she would never speak to his wife in such a manner again, and that if she could not treat the Duchess of Ravenscroft with the respect her position demanded, then she was not welcome in their home today or any day thereafter. The silence that followed was absolute, and Eleanor watched her mother's face cycle through disbelief and outrage before settling into something that might have been the first glimmer of understanding that her overlooked daughter had found a champion who would never allow her to be diminished again. The ballroom at Pembroke House glittered with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of October 1st, 1814, and Eleanor stood at the entrance on Frederick's arm, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that made her feel like an entirely different woman than the invisible creature who had spent 24 years fading into wallpaper while her sister commanded every room she entered, and she could feel the weight of hundreds of curious eyes turning toward them as the butler announced the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, could hear the sudden hush that fell over the assembled guests like a heavy velvet curtain before the whispers began their inevitable serpentine journey through the crowd. She had prepared herself for this moment during the 2 weeks since her wedding, had practiced keeping her chin lifted and her expression serene, while Frederick coached her in the subtle art of appearing utterly indifferent to the opinions of those who sought to diminish her. But nothing could have fully prepared her for the sensations of walking into a room where every person present knew the scandalous truth about the switched twins and the Duke who had married the wrong sister. Lady Harriet materialized at her side within moments, her silver hair gleaming beneath an elaborate tiara, as she tucked Eleanor's hand into the crook of her arm and began a purposeful circuit of the room, introducing her nephew's wife to a carefully selected group of society matrons whose approval could make or break a reputation. And Eleanor found herself drawing upon reserves of wit and intelligence she had never been permitted to display in her mother's house, engaging in conversations about literature and politics and the state of the war with Napoleon that left her companions visibly impressed despite their initial skepticism. She overheard Lady Ashton whisper to her companion that she could not understand what all the fuss was about, since the new Duchess seemed perfectly charming. And Mrs. Pemberton replied that she had always thought Lydia Sinclair rather vapid anyway, and perhaps the Duke had gotten the better end of the bargain after all. And Eleanor felt something warm bloom in her chest at the realization that she was winning these people over, not through beauty or flirtation, but through the very qualities her mother had dismissed as worthless for a woman seeking a husband. When Frederick claimed her for the waltz, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back as he guided her onto the dance floor, she looked up into his face and saw an expression of such unconcealed pride that she nearly stumbled over her own feet, and he leaned close to murmur against her ear that she was magnificent and that he had never been more certain he had married exactly the right woman. The Ton watched them dance together, watched the way the reserved and famously cold Duke of Ravenscroft looked at his wife as though she hung the moon and stars, and Eleanor knew that whatever whispers might continue behind closed doors, she had proven tonight that she was worthy of the position fate and her sister's desperation had conspired to give her. The letter arrived on a grey November morning, 6 weeks after the wedding, that had transformed Eleanor from invisible spinster to Duchess of Ravenscroft, and she recognized her sister's handwriting immediately on the cream-colored envelope that the butler presented on a silver tray, her heart clenching with a complicated mixture of longing and resentment and love that she had not fully sorted through in all the weeks since Lydia had fled to Scotland with her penniless artist and left Eleanor to face the consequences of a deception she had not designed but had willingly executed. She took the letter to Frederick's study, where he sat reviewing estate accounts, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth and casting dancing shadows across his handsome features as he looked up at her entrance with the soft expression he seemed to reserve only for her, and she held out the envelope with trembling fingers as she explained that Lydia had written at last, and she did not know if she possessed the courage to read whatever her sister had to say. Frederick set aside his papers immediately and drew her down onto the leather settee beside him, his arm wrapping around her shoulders as she broke the seal and unfolded the pages covered in Lydia's familiar looping script, and together they read the words that painted a picture of a life far less glamorous than Lydia had imagined when she had chosen love over security. Samuel's commissions had dried up, Lydia wrote, and their small rented rooms in Edinburgh grew colder as winter approached and the coal money dwindled, and she would never ask for herself. But Samuel had developed a cough that would not cease, and she feared what might happen if they could not afford a physician. And she knew she had no right to request anything from the sister whose life she had upended. But she was desperate, and Eleanor had always been the one with a tender heart. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes as she lowered the letter, torn between the instinct to help her twin, regardless of everything, and the knowledge that Lydia had manipulated her and abandoned her without a backward glance. And when she looked at Frederick, she saw the careful neutrality in his expression that told her he was waiting to follow her lead rather than impose his own judgment. She asked him what she should do, and he replied that the question was not what she should do, but what she wanted to do. And when she admitted that despite everything she could not bear the thought of her sister suffering, he nodded slowly and said that they would send assistance but with conditions attached, that the money would go directly to a physician and to securing proper lodgings, not into Samuel's hands where artistic temperament might redirect it toward canvas and paint. It was their first real disagreement, a quiet negotiation between her desire to trust and his determination to protect, and Eleanor realized as they talked through the firelit evening that this was what marriage truly meant, two people learning to navigate the space between their separate hearts until they found ground they could both stand upon together. Snow fell softly over Ravenscroft on Christmas Eve 1814, blanketing the estate in pristine white as Eleanor stood at the window of the morning room, watching the flakes drift past like tiny fragments of lace, her hand resting unconsciously against her stomach, where a secret had begun to make itself known through subtle signs she had not yet shared with anyone, not even the husband who had become the center of her universe in the 3 months since their unconventional wedding had scandalized and then captivated society. The visit to Edinburgh 2 weeks prior had been both necessary and painful, a journey she and Frederick had undertaken together to see Lydia and Samuel settled in the modest but comfortable lodgings that the Duke's money had secured. And Eleanor had stood in her twin's cramped parlour, looking at the sister who had once been her other half, and realized with a grief that felt like mourning that they had become strangers who shared a face, but nothing else. Lydia had been grateful in her theatrical way, had wept and embraced Eleanor, and sworn that she had never meant for things to unfold as they had. But there had been something hollow in her protestations, something that told Eleanor her sister would always see the world through the lens of her own desires, and that expecting anything different would only lead to fresh disappointment. Frederick had waited in the carriage during their private conversation, understanding without being told that this was a farewell Eleanor needed to navigate alone, and when she had emerged dry-eyed but trembling, he had simply opened his arms and held her, while the Scottish wind howled outside, and she let go of the dream of ever truly having her sister back. Now Christmas had transformed Ravenscroft into something from a fairy story, with holly and ivy adorning every mantel, and the great hall filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon, and Eleanor found herself marveling at how completely her life had changed since that September afternoon when she had been invisible and forgotten and certain that happiness was something meant for other women. She turned from the window as Frederick entered carrying a small velvet box, his dark eyes warm with the affection he no longer tried to hide behind his formerly cold exterior. And when he pressed the box into her hands and watched her open it, to reveal a delicate gold locket containing a miniature portrait of them both, she felt tears spring to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of a man who had once been a stranger and was now her dearest friend and most passionate love. She had a gift for him as well, though it could not be wrapped in paper or tied with ribbon, and as she took his hand and pressed it gently against her still flat stomach, and watched his expression transform from confusion to wonder, to such profound joy that it seemed to illuminate him from within, Eleanor knew that whatever storms lay ahead, and whatever whispers society might still offer behind their fans, she had found in this unexpected marriage a love that would sustain her through all the seasons yet to come, and that the overlooked twin had somehow become the most fortunate woman in all of England. The garden at Ravenscroft had erupted into riotous bloom by April 1815, and Eleanor walked slowly among the rose bushes, with one hand resting on the swell of her belly, where their child grew stronger each day, her flowing spring gown of pale yellow silk, designed by Frederick's own instruction to accommodate her changing figure, while still making her feel beautiful rather than merely functional. and she marveled at how different she felt from the woman who had stood in this same garden 7 months ago, trembling with fear and hope, and the terrible weight of deception. The staff greeted her with genuine warmth now as she passed, the gardener tipping his hat with a smile, and the housemaid who had brought her morning tea addressing her as "Your Grace," with none of the uncertainty that had coloured their voices in those first scandal-ridden weeks. And Eleanor understood that she had earned their respect, not through her title, but through the way she had learned to inhabit it, neither apologizing for her presence nor demanding acknowledgement, but simply being herself, and letting that self prove worthy. She had just settled onto the stone bench beneath the ancient oak when the butler appeared with the expression that always preceded unpleasant news, and her heart sank even before he announced that Lady Margaret Sinclair had arrived and was requesting an audience in the drawing-room. Frederick materialized at her side within moments, having somehow sensed the disturbance from his study where he had been reviewing correspondence, and he took her hand and asked if she wished him to send her mother away without seeing her. Eleanor considered the offer seriously, remembering the cruel words and the years of dismissal, and the moment her mother had looked at her with such disgust upon learning of the switch. But something had changed within her during these months of being truly seen and valued, and she found that Lady Margaret no longer held the power to wound her as she once had. She told Frederick that she would see her mother, but that she wanted him present, and the pride that flickered across his features warmed her more than the spring sunshine. Lady Margaret sat rigidly in the drawing-room, her face a careful mask of maternal concern that Eleanor saw through immediately, and the older woman began speaking of family and forgiveness, and how surely bygones could be bygones now that Eleanor had proven herself capable of securing such an advantageous position. Eleanor listened without interrupting, watching her mother's eyes dart to the visible evidence of pregnancy with barely concealed calculation. And when Lady Margaret finally paused for breath, Eleanor spoke quietly but firmly, explaining that she would not bar her mother from her life entirely, but that visits would be brief, and boundaries would be respected, and there would be no more pretending that the past had not happened. Lady Margaret's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the frustration beneath, but she nodded stiffly and departed within the hour, and as Eleanor stood at the window watching her mother's carriage disappear down the drive, she felt Frederick's arms wrap around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as he murmured that he was proud of her, and she leaned back into his strength, knowing that she had finally become the woman she had always had the potential to be. The pains had begun at dawn on the 15th of June 1815, starting as gentle waves that Eleanor had dismissed as the restlessness that had plagued her increasingly sleepless nights. But by mid-morning, they had intensified into something that could not be ignored, and she had gripped Frederick's hand and watched his face drain of colour as he realized what was happening, and immediately began shouting for the physician and the midwife and anyone else who might be of assistance in bringing their child safely into the world. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of mounting agony and determination, Eleanor lying in the great bed where she had first learned that her husband had known her true identity and had chosen her anyway, and she clung to that memory like a talisman as each contraction tore through her body with a force that seemed impossible to survive. Frederick had been banished to the hallway by the midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Thornton who would brook no interference from anxious husbands regardless of their rank, and Eleanor could hear his footsteps pacing, endlessly beyond the door, back and forth like a caged animal, and somehow knowing he was there gave her strength even when the pain threatened to drag her under. The complications came in the 8th hour when the baby refused to turn properly, and Mrs. Thornton's face grew grave, and the physician was summoned with urgent whispers that Eleanor strained to hear through her exhaustion, and for a terrible moment she thought of all the women who did not survive this passage and wondered if she would become one of them, if she would leave Frederick alone after they had only just found each other, if their child would never know the mother who had wanted them so desperately. But Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, had spent too many years being underestimated to surrender now, and she gathered every reserve of strength she possessed and pushed when they told her to push, and breathed when they told her to breathe, and refused to let the darkness at the edges of her vision claim her until finally, at 6:30 in the evening, a thin wail split the air, and Mrs. Thornton lifted a squalling, red-faced infant and announced that the Duke and Duchess had a healthy daughter. Frederick burst through the door before anyone could stop him, propriety forgotten entirely, and he crossed to the bed in 3 long strides and gathered Eleanor into his arms with such desperate tenderness that she felt tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said whether they were from joy or relief or simple overwhelming love. He was weeping too, this man who had once been known throughout society for his cold reserve. And when the midwife placed their daughter in Eleanor's arms, and Frederick curved himself around them both, his lips pressed to Eleanor's damp forehead as he whispered that she was the bravest woman he had ever known, and that he loved her beyond all reason and all measure, Eleanor understood that the overlooked twin had finally found her place in the world, and it was here, in these arms, with this family she had never dared to dream could be hers. They named her Charlotte, after Frederick's grandmother, who had been known throughout her life for her fierce independence and unconventional spirit, and Eleanor thought it fitting that their daughter should carry the name of a woman who had refused to be diminished by the expectations of her era. The days that followed the birth passed in a golden haze of exhaustion and wonder, Eleanor spending hours simply watching Charlotte sleep in the ornate cradle that had held generations of Ashworth children, marveling at the tiny fingers that curled around her own and the rosebud mouth that sought her breast with such determined hunger. And she found herself weeping at unexpected moments, overwhelmed by a love so vast it seemed impossible that her heart could contain it without shattering. Frederick proved himself in those early weeks to be nothing like the distant fathers she had observed throughout her life, the men who appeared briefly in nurseries to inspect their heirs before retreating to their studies and clubs. Instead, he was present constantly, holding Charlotte against his chest, while Eleanor rested and singing to her in a low voice that made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness. And when she asked him once if he was disappointed that their firstborn was not a son, he looked at her with such genuine confusion that she knew the question had never even occurred to him. Lady Harriet arrived on the 3rd day, sweeping into Ravenscroft with her customary energy, and immediately taking charge of ensuring that Eleanor was properly cared for and not permitted to overtax herself. And she held Charlotte with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 4 children of her own while pronouncing her the most beautiful infant she had ever seen, which Eleanor suspected she said to all new mothers, but appreciated nonetheless. The news of the birth spread quickly through society, and soon the entrance hall was overflowing with gifts and cards from families who 9 months ago had whispered about the scandal of the switched twins and now competed to demonstrate their congratulations to the Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, a transformation that might have felt like vindication if Eleanor had still needed such external validation, but she found that she no longer measured her worth by the opinions of people who had once dismissed her. On a warm evening in late June, with the windows open to catch the summer breeze and Charlotte sleeping peacefully in her cradle after her evening feeding, Frederick drew Eleanor onto the balcony that overlooked the gardens where they had first truly spoken, where he had mistaken her for her sister, and discovered instead someone far more captivating, and he wrapped his arms around her and told her that she had given him everything he never knew he wanted, a home that felt alive instead of merely maintained, a partnership of equals who challenged and supported each other, and now a daughter who would grow up knowing that her worth lay in her character rather than her conformity. Eleanor leaned into him and watched the stars emerge one by one above the estate that had become her home, and she thought of the woman she had been just 9 months ago, the overlooked twin who had resigned herself to a life of invisible service, and she sent a silent word of gratitude to that woman for finding the courage to step into the unknown, because that single terrifying choice had led her here, to this moment, to this love, to this extraordinary, ordinary life. The years that followed Charlotte's birth unfolded like the pages of a novel Eleanor might once have read in her lonely corner of the Sinclair Library, except this story was her own, and it exceeded anything she could have imagined during those long grey years of invisibility. By the autumn of 1820, Ravenscroft had become a home filled with the sounds she had never dared to dream would be hers. The patter of small feet on marble floors as Charlotte chased her younger brother William through the corridors, the infant cries of baby Rose from the nursery where the newest Ashworth had arrived just 3 months prior, and underneath it all, the steady presence of Frederick, who had proven himself over and over to be the partner she had needed without knowing she needed anything at all. Eleanor stood now at the window of the library where she had once shown him her Greek translations with trembling hands and a heart convinced that no one would ever see her true worth. And she watched Charlotte teaching William to identify the roses in the garden below, her daughter's voice carrying up with the same patient kindness that Frederick had always shown to Eleanor herself. And she felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming fullness of a life she had built from the ashes of her former resignation. She thought sometimes of the woman she had been on that September afternoon in 1814, the overlooked twin in dove grey who had believed her only purpose was to fade into the background while others lived their vibrant lives. And she wished she could reach back through time and tell that woman to hold on, to believe that the universe had something extraordinary waiting for her if only she could find the courage to claim it. Frederick found her there as the afternoon light turned golden, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder in the easy intimacy of 6 years of marriage. And when he asked what she was thinking, she told him she was remembering the woman who had been afraid to hope. And he turned her in his arms and cupped her face in his hands and told her that woman's courage had saved them both because she had stepped into the unknown and trusted that love might catch her. The scandal had long since faded into old gossip that no one bothered to repeat, replaced by the reality of a duke and duchess whose obvious devotion had become legendary throughout the ton, and Lady Margaret had eventually been permitted carefully supervised visits with her grandchildren, though she would never be welcomed as a true part of their family, and Lydia sent letters occasionally from the modest but happy life she had built with Samuel, whose paintings had finally begun to sell. Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, looked at her husband and thought of all the moments that had led to this one, the garden meeting and the library and the wedding veil and the night he had touched her birthmark and told her he did not care that she was the wrong twin, and she understood at last that she had never been the wrong anything. She had simply been waiting for someone perceptive enough to see what had always been there, and in finding him she had finally learned to see it herself.